All right, hello again. My name is Josh Eckels. I'm CTO here at LabKey. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, talking about the new NIH data management and sharing policy requirements that they've rolled out basically starting this year. Please go ahead and feel free to log questions in the Q&A tool here in Zoom. Planning to loop back on those at the end, but please log them as you think of them. And we've got a couple of polls that will be popping up through the presentation. So I encourage you to kind of submit some data, help us make this a little more interactive compared to just a one-way broadcast. So because many of you, many of the names I don't recognize in the list here, wanted to give people a very brief overview, about 2 minutes, of kind of what LabKey is and who I am. So LabKey has been doing data management and sharing for 2 decades now. So we started 20 years ago, basically embedded in one of the proteomics labs at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle. We spun off from that and for 18 years have been building out data management capabilities on our overall platform called LabKey Server. And we've supported a lot of groups doing a lot of really great things. And more recently, we've focused additional attention on things like sample management in particular, and biologics, and most recently developing really a general purpose LIMS, building on all of the experience and all the collaborations that we've had over the years. We've got a lot of different groups and a lot of different organizations using LabKey products. And you can see a lot of these are names that get significant funding from NIH. And so it's no wonder that people here are interested in learning more about kind of how they present themselves in their best light when they do their next funding application to NIH. And our product suite is pretty broad and growing. We've got different offerings to meet you kind of where you are, and then grow with you as maybe your organization expands as data management needs, or you do collaborations where you're pulling in new research data, new types of data, working with new kinds of collaborations. Kind of our simplest place to start is really around managing samples and their associated assay data, having integrated ELN, and then going all the way up into LIMS offerings and what we call our LabKey Server, SDMS, Scientific Data Management Software, that can integrate all sorts of different data feeds, do custom analytics and analysis and reporting, and then share that with the general world. But the reason that you're here today is to learn more about the NIH data management and sharing policy that is coming out as a new requirement this year. And basically, all new funding applications effective basically a month ago are going to have to submit as part of their application. And so we've got a poll to kind of see where people are at with their kind of next round of funding and applications, and it'd be great to kind of understand, who's kind of on the verge of needing this versus who's kind of learning about this more for the long term. But it's actually, I think, a pretty straightforward set of requirements and data that NIH is looking to collect here. Basically, you have to plan for how you're going to manage and share your data, probably something that you've been doing your entire career. You need to submit that plan. That's kind of the new thing here, as part of your application. And then, of course, you need to actually follow through on the commitments that you're making, assuming that you're lucky enough to get funded. And really, as far as the scope goes, basically, if you're asking NIH for funding, odds are this new policy applies to you. So there's kind of a bunch of different funding mechanisms from kind of the research side, whether it's an individual lab or at kind of a larger institutional level. And it also applies to their small business initiatives like SBIR, STTR. for kind of technology transfer into industry. And the things that are subject to these new management and sharing policies, basically it's your scientific data and broadly construed. And one thing that I think is also interesting to consider with this is not only are you required to share your data via repositories and have more information on that later in the presentation, but the expectation is that you've got systems in place to maintain that data for at least 3 years after the closing of the grant. And that may have some custom requirements depending on exactly what program you're applying to. But keep that in mind in terms of your budgeting and kind of your data retention planning. Odds are you want to be keeping that around for much longer for your own reuse, but contractually you're obliged to have at least that 3-year period. It doesn't include everything that you are required, that you're generating as part of your day-to-day research. So it's really the things that are backing up, your findings. So it's not kind of all of your internal work, all of your iteration and experimentation to get to your end result. So for example, it's not the drafts of all your papers. It's not all of your internal communications. This is not a Freedom of Information Act type of data sharing. This is really talking about kind of your findings and letting someone gain enough insight to be able to do their own analysis on top of that to validate and replicate what you've reported. There are some kind of narrow exclusions that are allowable for not sharing your data. And usually those are around things where you've got some existing legal obligation or the true patient privacy, things like that. But it's pretty clear that their intent here is that you're sharing what you produce and you're managing it up until that point where you're ready to share it. There are some specific rules around things like genetic data and patient data, HIPAA adjacent concerns. Not planning to do a deep dive on that today, but if that's something that you're interested in learning more about, please submit a question in the Q&A here, and we can use that as ideas for future webinars. And in general, you can't say, oh, my data is too small, it's not interesting enough, I don't know where to put it. And I'm just not going to look kindly on that as a justification. So the DMS plan is the way that you communicate your intent and exactly what data you're going to be generating, how you're planning to manage it, and where you're planning to put it. Their target length is 2 pages, so fortunately it's relatively brief compared to all the other things that are involved in submitting an application. Although I did find it informative that pretty much all of the samples that NIH provides, and they've got great resources for how to prepare these, they're, I think with one exception, all more than 2 pages. So I think there's a little wiggle room there, but brevity is reasonable here. They don't require a specific format, but they do provide a template. You can see kind of a screenshot of that on the right hand of the slide here. So I think it would be probably foolish to not take advantage of the template that they've got unless you've got some really specific reason why it doesn't apply to you. Basically, it's got 12 kind of prompts or sections. I'll summarize those as the next part of the presentation here. And I found it interesting up at the top here that they estimate it will take 2 hours to complete. I think they may be a bit on the optimistic side. But hopefully with this half-hour investment, you'll be on the verge of being able to do it in just 90 minutes when you're actually going to submit. And there's a lot of groups or repositories, organizations that are providing kind of sample text to say, oh, if you're planning to put your data here in the end, here's a blurb that you can use in response to one of the elements and one of the prompts. So please look for resources that you're planning to integrate with, deposit data in, etc. Odds are they are also interested in helping make this as smooth a process as they can. So going through basically those 12 different prompts, these are the things that NIH wants you to be talking about in your plan. So the data type, so this is really what I think of kind of the primary data, assay data, for example, that you're planning to capture, and then the file formats and things like that for how you're planning to collect and distribute that. Talking about some of the metadata, how to make this, give it the context that people need to understand what it is, how it got there, and then understand essentially how they can best reuse that. The tools, the software, the code that you're going to be using to make sense of all this data. So this is both the existing software and other tools that you may be using. If you've got things like LabKey Server, for example, or you're going to be using Proteome Discoverer or FlowJo or all of these other existing kind of standard off-the-shelf components, plus then all the things that you're planning to develop as part of your own analysis. And then, what are the standards? How are we kind of relating this to other data that people are generating and also reporting, so that we can hopefully align it and make sense and do meta-analyses and things like that after the fact. Then they want to be understanding where you're going to be putting this data in the end. So what are the repositories where your data is going to land? And this isn't necessarily just a single repository. In some cases, there will be a great fit that'll capture everything you need, but in other cases, there's probably going to be multiple that are appropriate. Helping understand where people can find it, because of course, just putting it in a spot and saying, well, it's out there. If you know the URL, you can get to it on the internet, isn't really helpful. We want to make it discoverable. And then looking at the timeline, when throughout your research are you planning to share particular things? Is it one giant dump at the end, or is it more of an ongoing depositing of data as you generate it, or kind of at certain milestones along the way? And then they're very interested in understanding how you are going to enable other groups to use this data. So what restrictions will it be under? What sort of consent was captured from subjects and participants in a study, for example, to collect the initial data to understand what downstream uses are acceptable. What are some of the limits, or what are the other expectations for the ways that the groups are allowed to leverage and further analyze and then share and publish their own findings. And then how are you going to kind of hold yourself accountable to delivering on what you're promising? This is, who's following up on this, who's making sure that you're hitting your milestones, you're depositing data at the right times and the right formats and things like that. Again, they're pretty open-ended on this. It's not that you need, a specific compliance approach or certification or things like that, but they're asking you to think about, right, how are we going to follow through on this? And here's our kind of general plan. And of course, for all of these, because we've got 12 things to cover in our response in a 2-page document, we're talking about a paragraph at most for most of these elements. So pretty concise, and you'll see that in the samples that NIH has provided on their DMS plan website. So I think that's a good place to pause for a moment and share our second poll. We're kind of trying to get a sense of how people are feeling about kind of their readiness to be able to respond to that with their existing systems. And then while that's rolling for responses, kind of talk through a little bit more of the details of how to achieve these things within the expectations that NIH is asking you to capture. So data management, is really something that I've been doing, well, not just here at LabKey, but in prior jobs as well. But this is really thinking about how we capture data consistently and accurately so that you can make sense of it, not only for yourself, but for others to be able to consume that downstream from you. So there's a lot of great best practices out there, and I'm sure you've all heard of FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable principles. But this is something to be thinking about throughout your research project, not just at the beginning when you're submitting this DMS plan to NIH, not just at the end where you're trying to export your data and get it in that repository to meet your sharing commitments, but in your day-to-day, because it's really miserable, I'm sure everyone knows, to try and do that management and organization as the last step in your research. So trying to think, how do you integrate this into your day-to-day? How do you not make it onerous so that people are encouraged to do it as part of their everyday practice? And there's a lot of great tools out there already and support. And we at LabKey have been doing this for 2 decades, helping groups integrate this into their day-to-day. Metadata is one of those things that it's really easy, I found, to criticize other people's collection of metadata. And so what I like to encourage people to do is to think about when you're looking at someone else's data and you're looking at one of these, say, repositories and trying to find something that you can mine and reuse for analysis, think about what you find most valuable when it's present and what you find most annoying or most infuriating when it's missing. There's so much that can be captured that you can never get everything. And really thinking about what are those common elements that you can provide, that you do want to see provided by others, to hold yourself kind of accountable to that same standard. And thinking about how you define and lay things out is really important from the beginning. It can also lead to gridlock as people get really stuck on exactly what fields to capture and what are the allowables, allowable values for any given one, things like that. But having a system in place, not just something that you've agreed to, kind of a handshake deal with all of your collaborators and research partners, but also having a system in place that actually enforces that. So you've got consistent collection of required fields, agreement on what the allowable values for a species or sample type or things like that are, is really critical to make this work throughout your entire process. Naming conventions is something I was a little surprised to see specifically called out on the NIH side, because it's, to me, a little bit kind of more detailed, kind of very fine-grained. This is something that I've seen groups have long extended conversations about. Well, should we use a file convention that has the year is 4 digits or 2 digits or things like that? Certainly don't include that level of detail, please, in your plan to NIH. But thinking about how you can consistently apply these things, because of course, everyone has their own favorite naming convention and it's no good if you don't collectively follow it. And having, again, some sort of data management system in place like LabKey offers can really make sure that you're validating and quality control flagging and things like that, data as it comes in to make sure it follows your convention, but also to automatically assign data and names and identifiers and things like that based on a convention that you set up, so that you're not expecting everyone to independently follow it and then reporting an error at the end of the process if they didn't meet your expectations. Common data elements is referring to kind of shared pieces of data. So maybe you've got multiple studies that are running, but you've got a common set of research subjects. So maybe those are participants in clinical trials, maybe they are animals in an animal colony, all sorts of different ways that things could be reused across multiple studies. And so think about ways that you can connect to those common data elements, that you don't need to necessarily replicate every piece of data about every common element, but that we can integrate these disparate data sources in a way that we understand that these are reused entities, but we can still get all the information that we need about each one of them. And so one way to do that is to have tools like LabKey that can connect to other systems or connect within itself to have a shared definition or a shared set of data and metadata about one of these elements that can be reused and leveraged, have a consistent, unique identifier across all of these different studies to be able to draw all those connections. Data storage formats is a little more of the kind of technical nitty-gritty of, right, are we doing XML files, are we doing JSON, are we doing spreadsheets, are we doing CSVs and TSVs? That's something that, again, you probably don't want to go into excruciating detail in your plan to NIH, but where you can speak to, right, we're going to use a common file format that is, well defined, well understood for your research area. Certainly referencing that's going to go a long way to speaking to, right, we're not doing custom one-off things that no one else is going to be able to integrate and make sense of down the road. So I think they do a nice job in some of their materials talking about kind of the small and simple data sets versus the more complex or sizable data, and trying to think about kind of those extremes for how we have an effective system to manage all of those things and connect them to each other. So if you're doing kind of ad hoc analysis, maybe a lot of that's in spreadsheets or TSVs or R data frames or things like that. And those are great, and being able to capture those so they're not just sitting on someone's laptop in your lab. But then also having that bigger structure where we're adding new assay results, but they need to be the same shape. They need to have the consistent format to be able to draw all of them together, and then being able to capture all of the analysis scripts and things like that you're using to be able to share those at the end, and also be able to reliably rerun them yourself along the way is really important. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is really that sharing part of that data management and sharing policy, where you need to get your data into a place where other people can find it. So NIH is really looking for researchers to use established repositories. They've got a list of 129, I think, kind of specialized repositories, plus a dozen or so, maybe general purpose ones. If you can't find a specific one that's really well suited to your data types, and they are focused on FAIR again, and they've got a list of criteria, maybe 20 or so things that are important to be thinking about in a repository in terms of its longevity, its ability to query and issue unique identifiers for any given data set, things like that. But I think odds are you're probably already working with a lot of these repositories, either as kind of a customer, where you're going to look for public data sets, or places that you're depositing data, either because it's already been a funding requirement for you for years, or because, say, the journal that you're submitting to requires that your data be deposited into a public repository. So, like I said before, thinking about how to select just the one that's a perfect fit for you or multiple. Hopefully, you've got existing experience getting data into the right formats. Maybe you can even say, hey, in your plan to NIH, we've already been, we've submitted 100 data sets to this repository. It's a well-worn path for us. We know what we're doing here. And in general, NIH is not looking for you to create your own repository. So shy away from that unless you've got a very compelling reason. LabKey does power some of the repositories that are on NIH's list and some that aren't yet. And these are really special purpose for given types of data. And I think that's what's great about NIH's approach here, that they are open to kind of whatever repositories are appropriate for the type of data that you're generating and kind of community standards within your research field. So just to recap, basically, if you're applying to NIH funding, this DMS policy applies to you. You need to plan and budget for how you're going to be managing it. And so I think of that as kind of the first step. You're generating the data, you're capturing it within your lab, and then eventually sharing it using the FAIR standards. You need to capture this in writing. NIH has some great templates, as I mentioned before, some examples to kind of get you going. Repositories and other tools are giving you snippets of text that you can just drop in directly, and really be thinking about how you've got the systems and processes and resources in place to comply with your plan, because it's not going to go well if you get to the end of your 5-year grant cycle and you haven't actually deposited any of your data in the repositories. So be happy to help you or discuss in more detail. As I mentioned at the beginning, LabKey has been doing this for 2 decades now. All sorts of groups, all sorts of sizes of studies and data types. And thanks very much for joining. And looks like I've got a few questions that I will pull up here. So let's see, I'll just go top down. So does scientific data include custom scripts used to manipulate, standardize the data being shared? So yes, it's clear from some of the descriptions and expectations and sample responses that NIH is looking for you to also share your analysis scripts and things like that. I think it's not important that you share every single version of a script that you've created along the way, because a lot of times you're doing method development or kind of exploratory work, but they are looking for you to share the scripts in a GitHub repository or other places like that. So please be thinking about that as part of what you need to capture, both in your plan and in your follow-through. Question, my lab works on preclinical drug discovery. We work with chemical compounds that have or will have IP protection. How can I be compliant with resource sharing requirement while not disclosing valuable intellectual property? Right, so I think this definitely gets to kind of that complicated intersection between what is required for the sharing and what is kind of allowable to omit. So I think that is, again, something that there's examples on NIH's website for the data sharing and management plan. I'd be happy to kind of brainstorm, kind of more specifics. But I think what you can do is set aside, kind of call out, right, these parts of the information, part of the research are proprietary, but just carve that out and maybe drop in kind of placeholder values or, kind of de-identified, if you will, information, not just about, say, subjects that are included, but also things like compounds that you may be developing and for whatever reason aren't in a position to share. Question on, will budget limits be increased to account for these additional requirements, or is expectation that research funds are repurposed? So I haven't seen anything saying that NIH is increasing the dollar amount available for these various funding mechanisms, but they have made it clear that they allow that these are allowable expenses. And so you can certainly include all of these data management tools or services or things like that that you might be thinking about as part of your application. But I don't think that they've, for example, increased the funding pool by 10% to cover these requirements. Question on, will this presentation be shared? Yes, so we will share both the slides and a recording. The fact that you've registered here means that you'll be on the email notification when those are available. Question on raw data. Are they processed to extract the kind of the real data? And is the expectation that the raw data will be shared or just the processed data? My understanding is that they are really looking to have that full data provenance shared. I think if there's very standard approaches for a given field that pretty much everyone works from, say, a first derivative of the raw data, and that's kind of the norm within a particular field, that would be okay to be the starting point. But in general, yes, they are looking to have kind of that entire reproducible analysis shared, the raw data, the scripts, the analyzed results, as part of kind of the overall footprint and expectations here. Are there repositories that provide the PI with rights to approve or deny sharing requests? So yes, some of these repositories do have, let's say a variety of different approaches in terms of, is it fully public? Is it something that you have to register for an account on? What are the expectations for notification or reuse or things like that? And the listing that NIH has provided of the 100-some repositories is at least kind of a couple of columns that help you understand, is this kind of an open submission? Is this closed submission? And then what are kind of at a glance the high level kind of requirements around reusing that data. So there is some flexibility there, and it does vary kind of repository to repository. So please kind of take a look at the candidate ones and dig in a little bit deeper. Question on, will these new regulations affect researchers' ability to use proprietary closed source software tools as part of their research? So in the examples that they provided of some of these the 2, 3, 4 page plans, there are some of them that definitely talk about using proprietary software, commercial software. So I don't think that is a major blocker by any means. And I think just kind of referencing it, saying this is a norm within this research field. Odds are, of course, the people who are reviewing your grant application are going to be familiar with these tools anyway. But I think just laying out the tools that you're planning to use and highlighting which ones are free or which ones are commercially available is a totally viable approach, and follows the pattern of their examples. Question on, there's no repository for data in my field. Where do I turn? So NIH has on their, again, the DMS policy and plan website, they've got what they refer to as generalist repositories. So these are, not specific. They're not geared towards any particular data type or, kind of research area. So, I think of them as a little bit more of like, just kind of a general file share, but a file share with expectations on how long it's going to be available and, kind of a little bit of the metadata around it. So I think if there's truly, not a norm, a place that you're used to going to look for data, or that you're seeing as a place where people are depositing their data for a journal publication or something like that, I'd look for those generalist repositories, because clearly NIH has stated that just because there isn't a custom one doesn't get you off the hook. for that sharing and repository step at the end. Then question, could you please clarify if this is an expectation of data sharing for ongoing grants? So this is an expectation for basically new grants. So my understanding is that basically at your next renewal, you'll be expected to submit your plan as part of that ongoing grant. But if you're currently kind of mid grant, let's say you got funded 2 years ago, you've got 3 years left on your grant. This is not retroactively required. Of course, getting along, the pathway here in your existing methodology puts you in a stronger position for your renewal to be able to say, right, we've been depositing our data here. We've been managing it to these standards already. This is not something new that you're taking on. It's more just you've got the opportunity now with this plan to formally share kind of what your standard practice has been going forward. So I think I got through all the questions. Thank you very much for joining us, submitting your questions, submitting your answers to the poll. Let us know if you found this helpful. As follow-up, happy to connect separately or connect you with other people at LabKey who might have worked with particular data types or getting data from their LabKey instance into a particular repository, kind of as part of that data sharing part. And look forward to hearing more from you. Thanks.